Thank you, David, for the introduction, and Chris for that fascinating talk. We're not quite, but almost the first anniversary of Schrems, so I think we should continue to give each other gifts to recognise the Schrems birthday. And bringing Chris here to talk to us this afternoon is part of ADAPT's gift to you all as a birthday present for Schrems. I've taken an awful lot of notes. I'm going to give an entire lecture based on what Chris has just done. Won't let the students look at the video. If nobody asks any questions, I've got those. But I think there will be lots of questions. So if you would introduce yourself before you ask the question, and then ask the question, that would be good. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I don't think so. Okay. So you just have to project.
Fred Loke, I'm a solicitor. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think it's very insightful about the law being a blunt instrument for data protection, and the clash of values between transatlantic at the moment, but maybe elsewhere. But I think if we were here 40 or 50 years ago, if we were alive then, we'd be talking, say, about gender inequality and how well, women haven't complained about not being able to work when they get married, or that they get paid less than men, so there must be no appetite for it. But, and it's a value thing, and everyone will tell you that there would be social and economic catastrophe if women were allowed work, there would be unemployment, our economy would be less competitive if women had to be paid equal pay for equal work, same as men. But over time, through a process called gender mainstreaming, gender became self-evident, and we're richer for it. So I'm just wondering if you think, and Giovanni Butticelli had an opinion there last month, where what looks like a call for privacy mainstreaming, where privacy issues are embedded not just in the legal framework, but in the political framework, the policy framework, resource allocation frameworks, and they're pushed out into the world by large institutions such as the United Nations, the European Commission, and their agencies. So I think the question is, do you think that is what we're seeing at the moment? And if it is, how do you think it will kind of play out in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think it's ironic, given the from the Schrems judgment, you might think there's a titanic clash between systems and they're so different. Actually, the reality of what happens on the ground, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years has been changing and has been moving closer together. And I remember well as a lawyer in like the late 90s, if you talk to about EU data protection law to companies, particularly outside the US, they would just, steam would come out of their ears. They couldn't even talk about it. They were so angry. Now I think they may still be angry, but it's become more part of the cost of doing business, and it's become accepted. And we've seen this, as you said, in many other areas that at first, you think of environmental regulation and others, that at first were very controversial, and then they just become accepted, and then there are kind of procedures. It becomes a compliance area, and certainly data protection has done this. And as I said, the GDPR is now creating a whole new economy for lawyers, for conference organizers and publishers, etc. And I think we're both probably in on that to some extent. But that's part of the way these things work, is they become kind of embedded in practice. And companies realize if you want to do business in Europe, you have to, at least the smart companies, you have to respect values in Europe and the law here. There have also been other interesting causes for this, like Sarbanes-Oxley and corporate governance legislation in the US and elsewhere. So I think in a way on the ground, things are sort of slowly moving together in a way. It's at the legal level where we have these massive clashes. And it seems a bit silly, I think, also to those of us who know both the legal level and the practical level, that there's, especially I think the US and the EU are not so different. If we were having these clashes with China, I would say, oh yes, that's a big clash of legal values, but we should be able to work this out somehow. And I hope that at the legal level we can come to match what's happening on the ground too.
Hi. Hi, thanks so much. That was great. Trinity College solicitor. I'm just wondering if really the reason why we're not getting a lot of enforcement action, or we're not really kind of interested, or possibly like that, in kind of going after each other, is because the debate has moved on, or the issues moved on to the grab for big data, and that we're now into the economic industrial age of data, and really that's what's happening. We have a lot of backlash over Facebook, WhatsApp mergers. Look at the concentration levels. Are we into an area where we're really about regulating the economic value of the data, or is the issue still, is there still something there on the public interest side where we protect data and the power over it, like the way we used to try and do for media and diversity of opinion?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, that's also a very good question. I think that, you know, there are different levels of that with regard to that issue. So I'm not trying to criticize, say, DPAs or others, because, you know, before a claim is brought, really you need to have an individual who wants to bring it, and most people have other things to do in their lives than bring data protection claims. You know, Max Schrems, it was suited him very well to bring it, and he was able to really become sort of now a historic figure almost out of it. But the Schrems case does show legal problems we've had with regard to data protection claims. So the fact that he had to then write in English, okay, he speaks English perfectly, but write in English to the Irish commissioner. I mean, most 99.9% of individuals in member states, if you said, okay, now you've got to send a letter to Ireland English, they would just throw their hands up and say, forget it, if they've even gotten that far. The GDPR does try to facilitate enforcement and claims, and I'm not trying to say there have to be just, you know, a lot of vexations and unnecessary claims, but there has to be some level of that's at least kind of credible, where you could say, you know, it's not the case that every violation of every law is enforced, but there has to be some at least minimal level of enforcement, and we're still a long way away from that. So I think there will be a lot more enforcement under the GDPR. Of course, that gives rise to other problems because of the global nature of the internet, and how can these actions be enforced. But as I said, what really vexes me is trying to have a cake and eat it too in a legal way, saying we will have all of these very complicated rules, but oh no, we'll never enforce them because it would cause so much disruption. That just irks me.
My name is Dennis Jennings. I have a background in the internet, and more recently in investment and corporate governance. I'd like to follow on from that question to talk about the cultural aspects of it, and to inquire how many people here shut down their WhatsApp account last Sunday week because it's fundamentally unacceptable. Or did people here who are in the cultural milieu of thinking that data protection and privacy is important actually say, well, you know, it's just too much of a hassle and it'll all be right on the night, and anyway, there's nobody to complain to, and what can I do about it, so bugger it, I won't get rid of WhatsApp. I did get rid of WhatsApp. I inquired of WhatsApp what they actually did with my contacts and got no response. I looked at their conditions and said, you know, I can't actually confirm that I have the authority to share my 4,500 contacts with anybody because I haven't talked to any of them, let alone 4,500 of them. So I cannot sign this thing, and that means that I have to switch the damn thing off. But I don't think there are many people in this room, in this culture, who actually are prepared to take a minor amount of pain to actually put action on the culture that they espouse.
That's actually a very good question. I'm going to answer personally. I shut down Facebook rather than shut down WhatsApp. So I cut down the other half. So did anybody take any action given the sharing between WhatsApp and Facebook? Did anybody take any action with either half of that equation over the last while for data protection reasons? Oh, this is a very unrepresentative sample. Let's nearly half. Probably if I asked this of my students, the answer would be none. So there's your answer. In this room, about half did.
Interesting. But I think that's the culture. And that refers back to the first question, that over time cultures become important and people accept them, drinking and driving and so on. And I think the reality illusion thing is all about culture. In the United States, there's a massive military-industrial complex which is given very high priority in the minds and emotions of Americans and companies and government. And after that, there's commerce. And in the American world, business and commerce and making money is more important than anything else. So if those are your cultural backgrounds, having pissy little data privacy get in the way is really appalling. But I think it will change.
Sorry, I'd just like to continue a little bit on that.
Sure.
Particularly when we're talking about WhatsApp and
You want to
Facebook.
introduce yourself?
Sorry, I'm Catherine O'Keefe. I'm a consultant in data privacy with Castlebridge Associates. Particularly when we're talking about something like Facebook or even more so WhatsApp, it brings up the question of the illusion of consent, because maybe we can delete our accounts, but they are a necessity for communication. I'm an American who lives here. I communicate with my family through WhatsApp because it's the most convenient
Signal,
communication mode.
3
Yeah, one of my actions has been trying to get all of my family members on
Me too.
Yeah.
Hold on, can I ask a different, Mr. Jennings said Signal. How many of you have successfully got somebody else to come on to Signal? I have tried and failed dismally. How many of you have tried and failed dismally? Okay, so it's about 3 success and about 6 unsuccessful, and the rest of you wonder what we're talking about. Sorry, so Catherine.
Yeah, so considering how much of our, on both sides of the Atlantic, how much of our conception of data protection is based around consent as a default mechanism, even though it's kind of the worst mechanism to use, we really do need to work more on privacy by design and looking at it from an engineering level rather than a legalistic consent level.
Any other questions? Angelica? Yeah, and then.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with you on privacy by design, because realistically, I'm Angelica Phillips and I'm just at the Morgan. But I read a lot of terms and conditions and privacy policies online, particularly for direct consumer DNA testing companies. And the reality is that people don't engage with these contracts and privacy policies because they don't have the time. And I think there is a real need for regulators to get on board and help protect people as well. It's not really a realistic choice between consenting and not consenting sometimes. It's just like staying in touch with your family. I'm from New Zealand and very limited options of staying in touch.
Just a second. Did I see another hand in the back? I did, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Alex White. I'm a practicing lawyer, formerly politician, perhaps not formally always, but formally for the moment. And I was very interested in the point that you made about the politics of this debate versus the strict legal issue. Now, of course, laws are made by politicians, so they're not entirely separate, but I take the point very much that you make, that the idea that we can find lots of post-Schrems to bring challenges is just not real. And I think that's been reflected in what the last speaker said as well, and a few of the other contributions. So I'm wondering, at what level, I mean, I attended meetings of the Council of Ministers dealing with communications issues, now not data protection, but just a broader policy question in terms of the digital market and so on. And I was very much impressed by the reality that it is economic interests in Europe that is actually a big driving force for a lot of the policy narrative that's going on. So, I mean, for example, there are more than one occasion when there was an issue arose about some of the tech giants and their dominance in Europe. I would get the evil eye from the Commissioner that we're looking at Ireland and we have a particular view of Ireland's role in all of this. So, I mean, last December, there was an enormous step forward on the issue of climate change. So ultimately, countries were prepared to compromise, at least to some extent, their economic interests in order to do something right for the future of the planet. I wonder whether you think there's any prospect at all. I doubt there'll be a sort of a COP-type agreement, but it seems to me unavoidable that if any of the issues that have been raised here are genuinely to be addressed, they will only be addressed at the supranational, international and supranational level. Because there simply isn't any reason, any reality in our relying on issues of consent, whether it's done engineering or private, our own sort of sitting at the laptop. Most people are overwhelmed by it. Perhaps overwhelmed is a strong word, but they're either not interested or they're overwhelmed by it. So it's only at the level of international agreements, ultimately, made by politicians, however minimalist those agreements might end up being, that we can actually progress this agenda, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, although not so much at the, let's say, the constitutional level in terms of, let's have now the UN has a global treaty on privacy. I think what's happening now and will help in the future is just contacts between governments and regulators. There are some very useful initiatives going on. For example, the data protection authorities have a kind of global network of enforcement. They're trying to build that. There's a lot of work done by the OECD and in that regard. So, as academics know, there's been much research done in the last few years about sort of transnational governance networks or regulatory networks. And I tend to think the world is so fragmented that waiting for that would be making the perfect the enemy of the good. So we should perhaps try to strive for some sort of global agreement, but in the meantime there are many things that can be done at a lower level. I think what also needs to be done at the EU level is create more transparency. It's just, this is one of the biggest criticisms about the Privacy Shield is why does this have to be negotiated in secret and we don't know the details, and then suddenly when it looks like the negotiations are broken down, as a reporter found out, there was a late night call between Franz Timmermans, who's really kind of the guy who runs the commission, and John Kerry, the Secretary of State, and they agreed on something. So, this isn't, the world is not going to be endangered if we learn the details of the Privacy Shield ahead of time. So, and of course this would help it with generally Euroscepticism too, but that's another topic which I won't get into.
Looking at the time, I know that Mr. Jennings wants to come back, and I'll take one question on top of that as well. Pardon? Okay. Well then we've got four. Let's very quickly, in this order, 1, 2, 3, and David, and then we'll put them all to Chris. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very briefly, I'd like to sort of change the discussion from the macro to the micro and invoke Robert Peel, the man who put policemen on the street to secure our physical world. And I think it's about time that we started thinking about policemen on the street to secure our cyber, our e-world. If things go wrong in any respect in your personal e-world, there is nobody to whom you can complain. And if you do complain, as has happened to me, you'll be told that's from out of the jurisdiction. And we have no jurisdiction outside the jurisdiction, which is actually not true anyway. But, so I'm now appealing for a Robert Peel moment for our infrastructure and put boots on the ground to address these issues. I don't expect a response.
Electronic boots on the ground.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Arosha Haidar. My background is healthcare ethics and law and risk management. I'd just like to have a question to yourself from the panel in regard of coding the human genome. We know that it's available now. We know that you can send a sample from inside of your mask by post to certain companies in the state for $100, and they can run all your genome, give you access to your risk, and that's very good to help medical line to have a precision medicine. The problem, who owns the data? Who else can have access to the data? Because as a human being, I feel I am responsible to know my risk and reduce it, reduce the necessity of using healthcare if I can prevent it. But the problem, who else will know? And how is going that to affect my insurance, my applying for a mortgage, my driving license renewal, what other things that I'll be targeted by purely having this data out there. And the problem, I researched it thoroughly, and I couldn't get any answer on who have access to the data. If there is a problem of these data being shared, who do a person can go to continue to have their privacy and not to share that kind of data outside their consent. Thank you.
Okay, there is a long answer which Angelica has to this, but I think also, and I'll bring Angelica in a second for it, but I think also you have given us a topic for a talk after Christmas, so watch this space. So the short version of the long answer.
It will really depend on the company, and I've compared 71 contracts of companies that provide health testing of the UK environment, and a very high percentage of companies include a clause allowing them to unilaterally change their terms, which means that they could change their policies on who they share data with, or how long they store it for, or what they do with it. And so I would be very cautious about engaging with a lot of these online DNA testing companies. And if you really want to know the answer, to read the contract very carefully. But I can also give you my contact details.
So this is speed dating, data protection. Third question.
There's a new Irish law about protecting the images of children, which is just out. And I'm just wondering, how would that actually be enforced?
David, your question?
Yeah, just to finish off and to bring us back where we started, Chris, and picking up on Alex's point as well. On the one hand, the Court of Justice in Schrems has kind of opened up this new era of data protection diplomacy. But on the other hand, it's tied the hands of the negotiators, of the diplomats, of the political organs. And I just wonder whether you had any thoughts on whether the court has left sufficient room for manoeuvre for the political organs in ultimately arriving at a political accommodation of the important fundamental rights and legal standards.
All right, well, I have a tall order. I'll try to give a very brief response. Policeman on the street, I think that probably what would be most effective is to empower individuals to bring claims, and also not just through data protection authorities, but in court. Of course, there's a potential misuse of that too. We've seen in the U.S., for example, but I think that is done in the GDPR, so it will be interesting to see. Is some of the pressure taken off just the data protection authorities doing everything, and individuals maybe bringing suit individually or as a class? Coding the human genome, yes, that's already been responded to. I would just use this example to point out data protection is something very, very important, and it goes far beyond. There's something what I would almost call sometimes the banalization of data protection, that everything is about cookies, everything is about Facebook. Now, I've been involved in we have a project now in the university working with the International Committee of the Red Cross to produce data protection policies for international humanitarian organizations. That's really a matter of life and death, and this is, your example is too. So it's really a very, very important topic, and it goes beyond some of these internet issues. I know it's not politically correct to try to make a hierarchy of rights, but here I think in some ways we need to focus a little more about what's really at stake in data protection. The law about the images of children, that's very interesting. I mean, the GDPR has for the first time explicit rules about data processing of children's data, which the US has had for a long time. And there are very complicated rules about that, but certainly there will be the possibility to protect those images under data protection law, but I can't obviously go into detail about that here. And then to David's question, this is very interesting. I think if you look at the judgment, the court has sort of tied the hands of the Commission and others wanting to negotiate on behalf of the EU. However, we also know that the court is very clever at sometimes saying, well, yes, but we didn't quite mean it that way. You know, you misread it. And we see this a little bit if you look at this opinion of Advocate General Mengozzi in the Canadian PNR case, which came out there kind of, you know, it's quite possible the court could say, okay, we're going to really put down a strong line in the sand, that's done, and now maybe we'll just slightly back away from it. I don't know. But you know, clearly the the jurisprudence of the court also has a lot of twists and turns beyond just the pure logic. So we'll have to see what happens in that regard.
And that strikes me an excellent note on which to bring the proceedings to an end. I have, as I said, got loads and loads for my next several classes. I think everybody was nodding along. They've got loads. You've all got loads and loads too. And I think I should like to thank Chris for a stimulating afternoon. I have to thank the Hub for the use of the hall and ADAPT, the Centre for Content Technology here in Trinity, for hosting us. Thank you very much for coming. Bye-bye.